Sometimes we stand in awe of a famous string player's ability to cover great distances on the fingerboard and settle in the right spot with incredible swiftness and accuracy. I've seen again and again that the most important ingredient of this wizardry is an innate homing instinct. To possess it constitutes a significant part of talent, but irrespective of the degree to which one is blessed with it, everybody can do a great deal about improving left-hand facility through a better understanding of certain motor sensations and an increased familiarity with sharply circumscribed parts of the fingerboard that we call positions. Toward attaining this goal of positional awareness, I've written the exercises in Chapter H. They are divided in Section 1 into 4 parts. First, I practice quintuplets on every degree of a major scale through 3 octaves, up to diatonic steps from the root finger and back. It is of the utmost importance to make sure right away that every playing finger has absolutely the same setting weight. The unoccupied lower numbered fingers remain on the string, their weight reduced to a very light touch. The energy used in placing a finger must be matched when the finger is lifted. Casals and many other outstanding string players, including violinists, thought that the articulation of the lower note was helped by a slight but precise plucking movement at the removal of the higher finger. I concur wholeheartedly with this, particularly in fast and low passages that tend to sound indistinct otherwise, as in this example from Beethoven's Quartet, Opus 59, number 1. Naturally, this plucking must not sound like pistol shots when we play a slow melody. But I've seen with many students how intonation and articulation and speed were improved by the device of slight pizzicati in downward progressions. The second version of this exercise omits the fourth of the original 5 notes. Here we leave the first finger on the string, but not the middle finger, for which we have no further use. The third version, which omits the second of the 5 notes, seems to be more difficult. I can honestly say that I've rarely seen an entering student of mine who could cope accurately with sequences of this kind, as they appear, for instance, in the last movement of Mozart's F major quartet. The reason seems to be not only the failure to space at once all the fingers used in any one position. That can be learned easily enough when the notes go up. The special difficulty lies in having a finger ready in the descending part of a motif that has not been placed ascending. The same problem is encountered whenever we initiate a new position with the top finger and go down by consecutive seconds, as at the beginning of the Saint-Saëns concerto. Again, the compass of each position has to be established. The middle finger is initially suspended, but spaced correctly. It is then sounded by a vigorous plucking of the top finger and activates in turn the first finger. Within the compass of a major third, the tendency of the second finger to be too close to the first has to be fought by mentally chopping off the third finger so that the second can bisect the distance between the outer fingers. The fourth version is a trill exercise that leaves the unused finger off the string. In our last session, I encouraged you to drop the hand freely onto thumb positions that had just been practiced in stepwise progressions. Now, if I were to wake you up in the middle of the night and ask you to play, for instance, the 7th degree of C major, second appearance on the A string, you should be able to rattle off the required 3 notes. Or 1st degree F sharp major, first appearance on the C string. Or 6th degree D flat major, second appearance on the G string. Play this game all over the fingerboard with your friends, not necessarily at midnight. Just be routinely ready for it anytime. Now, I would like to explain why I put scales in broken thirds and in solid thirds and sixths next to the diatonic groupings that we just practiced. When I have learned to play, let us say, C, D, E in second position on the A string, I can transfer any of these notes straight across to the D string and obtain, with the same spacing, a minor third, A, C, and 2 sixths, F, D, and G, E. And when I rearrange the order of the 3 notes, I can play as part of a scale in broken thirds, C, E, D. Cellists are sometimes apprehensive about this passage at the end of the first movement of Haydn's D major concerto. But if it were rewritten in this way, it would lose much of its difficulty because we would not have to produce any notes descending that we had not placed before ascending. So it's the same problem as in the Mozart quartet. The difference between the 2 versions in the Haydn concerto is minimized when the arrival on each new second finger coincides with the exact spacing of the other 2 fingers and is followed by a precise pluck from the middle to the lower note. Another famous example of a passage in broken thirds comes from Beethoven's 3rd Rasumowski quartet. Problem and solution remain the same. Going beyond what I wrote in chapter H on page 24, I have spelled out exactly on pages 71 and 72 in the calisthenics how I think scales in broken thirds ought to be worked on with and without the bow. As we begin our studies of scales in solid thirds, the first paragraph on page 35 needs to be fixed firmly in our minds. We must remember that in a major key, the major thirds appear on the 1st, 4th, and 5th degrees. The others are minor. In a minor key, the major thirds are on the 3rd, 5th, and 6th degrees. Major thirds, when played across the strings, have to be understood to mean a closed hand position, minor thirds wide in instrumental terms. Horizontally, the major scale has 2 half steps between the 3rd and 4th and the 7th and 8th degrees. Elsewhere, there are whole steps. In the harmonic minor scale, the half steps will be found between 2 and 3, 5 and 6, 7 and 8, and an augmented second from the 6th to the 7th degree. This recognition of intervals, vertical and horizontal, has to be from the beginning an intellectual one. Our ears must not be used for fishing expeditions. Their job is one of fine-tuning, not of making corrections by half steps. I suggest, therefore, that we begin the conquest of solid thirds by practicing exercise number 1 on page 35, spelling out the vertical and horizontal intervals aloud until there are no more mistakes. Now this is great to increase the familiarity with the fingerboard, but we cannot deal swiftly enough with these varying distances by telling, for instance, the fourth finger on the first degree to move a whole step to the second degree while the first finger moves a half step, and so on. In any fast passage, we would all feel like hopelessly confused centipedes. Fortunately, there's a much simpler and more effective way by moving horizontally but thinking vertically. We do this by spacing our fingers diatonically on the upper notes of a major scale in thirds, then transferring the top finger to the next lower string. As we shift from degree to degree, we identify in our minds each new finger placement from above, like a pianist, although all one sees is the horizontal motion. Only on the diminished fifth of the seventh degree do we have to go from a third to a fourth finger in the transfer to the lower string. But when we get to the minor scale in thirds, we encounter too many diminished and augmented fifths to make transfers practicable. However, by then I hope that this crutch can be discarded and that as a third and final step, we can figure out the placement of each third independently. In harmonic minor, the vertical pattern will be wide, wide, narrow, wide, narrow, narrow, wide, wide. Early on, we should get used to listening for the resulting Tartini tones when we play double stops. I explain this phenomenon fully on page 17. As you can see at the bottom, at figure 2, for major thirds, these resultant sounds are 2 octaves below the lower note of the third. For minor thirds, the Tartini tones are a major third plus 2 octaves below the lower note. In low positions, you may not always hear them clearly. Nonetheless, you will immediately notice an added clarity and richness when the intervals are just. When you hit them right, it is like the sun coming out from behind the clouds. Only on the second degree of a major scale do I not look for a just third. In D major, for example, the Tartini tone of the third E-G would be C natural, which is useless as it is out of the key of D. Treat this third somewhat narrowly as the fifth and seventh of a dominant seventh chord with a high E. On the other steps, the Tartini tones of thirds are the tonic for the first and third degrees, the subdominant for the fourth and sixth degrees, and the dominant for the fifth and seventh degrees. After you have conquered the exercises on pages 35 and 36, look for the ones on pages 75 and 76. They are a daily must in a different key every day. Exercise number 4 on page 35, which is repeated at letter D on page 77, is one of the best and also most excruciating intonation exercises I know. It is extremely revealing in its demand for clean, perfect fourth, as one raises the upper or lowers the lower note of a third by a second. Scales of sixth. are also fine for firming our sense of position and keeping our hands loose for a free vibrato on double stops. Both thirds and sixths can be used for all bowings on two neighboring strings, as indicated on pages 37 and 77. For instance, up to now, we have tried to come closer to left-hand mastery by the identification of positions. Now we ought to deal with the motor impulse that propels an aptly placed arm toward a new goal. Until the recent inclusion of some jazz elements in the so-called classical idiom, one really never embarked on a slide which just moved along leisurely until one arrived at the terminal pitch, like the clarinet at the beginning of the Rhapsody in Blue. Instead, our technique has been directed toward achieving either an inaudible relocation of the hand in keyboard fashion, what I understand to be a shift, or expressive, vocally inspired connections of limited duration called slides or portamentos. Anticipation is the key word in shifting. Anticipation of the coming pitch in the inner ear, anticipation of the exact time of arrival, anticipation of the motion carrying us toward our goal. This motion is inextricably linked to the moment of settling down, a single-minded zeroing in on our objective, aiming, moving, seizing in one act of determination. Since this sensation will remain with us once it has been understood, the practice of shifts in scales and arpeggios will usually suffice to keep it alive. But the need for its thorough initial assimilation makes the conquest of pages 38 through 41 in all keys an unavoidable prerequisite. Every time a shift calls for special attention, we ought to ask 4 questions. 1, are we firmly in control of the finger from which we shift, and is it positioned in such a way that the coming note is directly accessible without changing the profile of the forearm from elbow to knuckles? A high top knuckle of the playing finger, the result of a firmly placed fingertip, is a good indication of our readiness to take off. 2, can we identify the place of arrival independently, again with a solidly placed finger? If the answer is negative, we shall need more stationary practice in the area for which we are aiming to establish greater regional familiarity. 3, can we vary our finger weight from the possessive setting strength that initiates both the old and the new note to the floating lightness that permits the utmost mobility of the whole arm, supple even in the fastest movements? 4, to what extent can the bow arm help the left-hand actions? All too often, only the second one of these 4 questions is being asked, reducing the inquiry to, did I or did I not get the new note? This disregards the primary importance of being set up properly for any physical action before one can assess the action itself. It may also overlook an inept way of traveling toward a new note or omit the consideration of synchronization of right and left arm activities. Shifts and slides can be made on the same finger or going from a lower number to a higher numbered finger or vice versa. We've already practiced them on the same finger in chapter D. The other shifts are treated systematically in chapter J. I begin with the shifts from lower to higher fingers. We are offered two possibilities here. Either we glide on the old finger and the new finger occupies its place from above at the exact time that the new note is due. I call these open shifts because the relation of the old to the new finger leaves the hand spread out. When the shift coincides with a bow change, it occurs on the old stroke. Or we knit the two fingers involved closely together during the shift, which is completed on the new finger. In case of a bow change, it is synchronized with a takeover by the new finger. Because of the compactness of the hand, I call these the closed shifts. An open shift must have the suppleness of a cat in the arm movement. A cat doesn't crush the mouse with its body, it lashes out with its paw. Likewise, it is the strength of the finger that firmly seizes the new note. The approach can be stealthy, which will give us a deliberate portamento. Or lightning fast jumping onto the new finger. But neither the speed of the motion nor its direction, upward or downward, must vitiate the lightness of the arm. Under no circumstances must there be an isolated extraneous pitch between departure and arrival. When the music calls for a shift on a D octave, we must not also hear an uncalled for B in between. If even in the most leisurely slides the old finger is lifted as the new one strikes, we shall avoid those horrid old beer garden slides that used to disgrace even the gentlest melodies. Let us be grateful for their demise and hope they remain banished forever. Shifting upwards from a higher numbered to a lower numbered finger involves almost always a horizontal movement of the new finger. The exception may be a thumb falling into place from above on a very snappy shift. In a slow tempo, the new finger will sometimes snuggle right up to the old finger before replacing it. In fast passages, the new finger will dart forward from its original position, pushing the old finger up into the air. Again, the arm will move with the utmost lightness, while the weight of the shifting finger may range from minimal in inaudible shifts to somewhat heavier in certain portamentos. But there are few slides so emotion-laden that some let-up is not advisable. Downward shifts have the same options as the shifts from lower to higher fingers. The new finger will either strike from above, or the two fingers involved in the shift will be knitted together. Infallible rules cannot be established on when to use open or closed shifts. The choice will depend on pitch security, smoothness, and stylistic considerations. But here are some samples of choices to be made. Let us take first that lovely old tune, The Melody in F by Anton Rubinstein. The sweetness of the first two phrases, going from the two short notes to the long climactic ones, makes for me the closed shift preferable. Going up to the C, one can either leave the thumb behind the neck or place it squarely on CG for a standard octave position. But the portamento to the D is one of those thrusts where I would say go for it, never mind the exact position of a trailing thumb. This gives me a better chance for a free vibrato, especially toward the end of the piece when the melody goes on to a high G, equally unencumbered by a crowded hand position. However, the shift from the long note to the two short ones in the third phrase seems more succinct when it is open. The B is here only a way station before the high C in the next measure. Now, from the first movement of the Brahms double concerto. While the solo violin can sound perfectly convincing in going to both top notes of the second theme, either with open or closed shifts, for the cello there is too great a distance and not enough leverage between old and new fingers, so I prefer closed shifts, if any. Sometimes an enharmonic change will facilitate a shift. In this example from Bloch's Cello. It is easier for me to shift to a second rather than to a third finger on the top note, and to call it a C sharp with the thumb on A instead of a D flat with the thumb placed diatonically on a B flat. Finally, a word about long distance thrusts toward accented harmonics. Start them with a slow bow and let go only upon arrival. For example, in the Walton concerto on a fast shift. Or in Bartók's Sixth Quartet on a slow one. Next time, I hope to put our fluency in shifting to good use in scales and in part 8 in arpeggios.